Do you want us to mute when it's not our turn to speak?
Yeah, okay. So if everyone can kind of mute when you're not speaking, that's fine. Welcome everyone. Recording and transcription have started. Oh gosh. Okay, that's new. Let me see. Okay, yeah, now that should be fine. So welcome everyone. This is another one of our regular pair roundtables. The idea of those meetings is to invite colleagues and students and discuss topics of importance for us here. You know, the idea is that we kind of build and we foster our kind of community in politics and international relations, and do it in interesting and stimulating ways. So this time we have a very special event because we have not one but two guest speakers from outside of our institutions. I will introduce them in a moment. The topic is Europe and the rise of China. This time also the event is a little bit different in a way that we will have a follow-up reception. I would like to invite you, students and colleagues, if you are on or around campus at 3 p.m., right? So half an hour after we will finish, because we are aiming to finish at 2:30. So at 3 p.m. in building 100, that's the new building, and in room 5013, 5013. 5013, and we'll have some food and some drinks. So you are welcome to come and join us to have a bit of a discussion. So today we have, excluding myself, three speakers. We have Ambassador Dr. Volker Stanzel from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Mathieu Duchâtel, Director of the Asia Program at Institut Montaigne in Paris. Thank you very much for joining us too. And we have Dr. Monique, last but not least, our own lecturer in Chinese politics at the University of Southampton. And great to have you, Monique, too. I will briefly introduce the topic and then I will hand over to our speakers. So what I want to do kind of very briefly before I let other speakers talk is to introduce the topic of China in international relations briefly through the lens of some mainstream kind of discussions in international relations. So well, one last thing before I do that, I should mention that this event has been generously supported by the European Union through its Erasmus Plus program and the Jean Monnet chair. So China in international relations, there is of course a growing interest in the role of China in international relations in Eurasia, in Asia, in Southeast Asia. Today, our main focus will be Europe and how Europe can or should respond to the growing economic and perhaps security and political cloud of China. What I want to do is to share with you a few kind of representative quotes from some of the mainstream debates and discussions about China in international relations to give you the flavor of how that rise is being pictured and discussed in the literature. So perhaps one of the most influential voices in international relations, mainstream kind of discussions on international relations about the prospects of China becoming increasingly powerful and important in relation to other states, comes from John Mearsheimer, who famously proclaimed that it is very unlikely that China will rise peacefully. He believes that the rise of China must inevitably lead to conflict with the United States in the future. And of course, he draws that conclusion based on his own theoretical kind of preferred paradigm that we called offensive realism or offensive neorealism. So what he says here is that in the quote, offensive realism offers important insights into China's rise. My argument in a nutshell is that if China continues to grow economically, it will attempt to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. The United States, however, will go to enormous lengths to prevent China from achieving regional hegemony. Most of Beijing's neighbors, including India, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Russia, and Vietnam, will join with the United States to contain Chinese power. The result will be an intense security competition with considerable potential for war. In short, China's rise is unlikely to be tranquil. Okay, so kind of very ambitious prediction, but that is one feature of American international relations. They like to predict things, and they believe they have solid grounds to do so. Now, another quote that I want to share with you comes from Graham Allison and his book that is well known among our students, Destined for War. Again, he is also rather pessimistic about the future of China in international relations and the prospects for peace related to China's rise. What he says, one of the things he says, is that what America needs most at this moment is not a new China strategy, or what passes for strategy in Washington these days, but instead a serious pause for reflection. If the tectonic shift caused by China's rise poses a dilemma of genuinely Thucydidean proportions, then calls for a more robust or muscular pivot will amount to little more than taking an extra strength aspirin to treat cancer. If the United States just keeps doing what it has been doing, future historians will compare American strategy to illusions that British, German, and Russian leaders held as they sleepwalked into 1914. In short, what Graham Allison proposes is that the United States fundamentally, and its allies, of course, fundamentally rethink the way they approach China, and that they forget about the kind of usual approach or usual kind of toolbox, containment, etc., that those kind of traditional strategy that have been deployed against the Soviet Union, for example, during the Cold War, they are bound to fail and lead to conflict. Another quote that I want to share comes from Robert Kaplan and his book that has become kind of well known outside of academia. This is not a strictly academic book. It's meant for popular audience, Asia's Cauldron. And in that book, one of the things he says is, because Washington is seen as the agitator of South China Sea disputes, it is the United States, not China, that needs to be deterred. After all, China dominated a tribute system based on Confucian values that defined international relations in East Asia for many centuries and resulted in more harmony and fewer wars than the balance of power system in Europe. So the West and the United States have nothing to teach China in regard to keeping the peace. Right? That is certainly the Chinese perspective, but that's something that the United States and the Western countries cannot ignore. And this is yet another invitation to rethink and reconsider how we think about the geopolitics of Eurasia and the rise of China in international politics. The last quote that I want to share with you comes from Noam Chomsky, who is famously critical of American foreign policy, and he wrote a book called Who Rules the World, one of many books that he wrote, and here is a short quote from that book. The State Department warned China that if it wants to be accepted in the international community, which is a technical term referring to the United States and whoever happens to agree with it, then it must not skirt and evade international responsibilities which are clear, namely follow US orders, China is unlikely to be impressed. So that's his take, unsurprising take on China in international relations. Now, the last remark that I want to make before handing over is about Europe. And for Europe, China does represent a challenge and a dilemma. Now, the representative example of that dilemma, I think, can be encapsulated on the one hand in the agreement in principle that was reached, the agreement in principle on investment that was reached in December 2020 after 7 years of negotiations. The European Union and China agreed on some principles concerning investment that this agreement was supposed to be groundbreaking for European companies which want to invest in China. A few months later, European Union Council imposed sanctions on a number of countries, including China, for violating human rights. The sanctions were directed at a number of China's individuals, and that was in March 2021. Immediately, China retaliated with sanctions against a number of EU institutions, and including a number of members of the European Parliament. And luckily for the agreement that I just mentioned, it is the European Parliament which co-decides with the EU Council and needs to approve that agreement before it enters into force. So the European Parliament already announced that it will not ratify that agreement before those Chinese sanctions are removed. So this is just a kind of brief example of how complicated those relations are. And now I'm happy to hand over to our speakers, our guest speakers. And I first want to invite Dr. Volker Stanzel, who will say a few words about China and international relations, and specifically will look at Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamil, and thanks to you and to the Institute for having me. Not only that, but also for discussing and proposing to discuss an issue that I think is extremely important. Also, I want to thank the European Union for supporting this. I bet a few eyebrows in Brussels were raised listening to you quoting 5 American voices on China and not one European, but never mind, we now are Europeans here among ourselves, and as we had agreed beforehand, our major topic will be Europe and China, not just the EU, obviously, as you're in Southampton. Now, as I said, this is an important issue, and the most important aspect to it is basically the economic relationship. We will talk about politics, and politics is vital and essential, especially now under Xi Jinping. But the reason why we have a close relationship and why China worries us is the economic relationship. Now, the trade exchange between the European Union and China in 2020, was about 600 billion euros, and thus China became the most important trading partner for the EU. You Brexiteers over there, you probably know the figures for the UK, and bring that together, and the figure is even more impressive. Against that backdrop, I want to make 3 points. One is on Lithuania, and it illustrates quite well, I think, some basic facts about our relationship with China. I won't go into the political controversy that we have with Lithuania. We may discuss that later. But the fact was that when Lithuania took a political decision to increase have to initiate a bit closer kind of relationship to Taiwan. The People's Republic reacted fiercely and imposed sanctions against Lithuania, not permitting any Lithuanian imports into China anymore, and not permitting goods imported from the European Union containing parts produced in Lithuania, nor permitting exports of goods from China to Europe, any European country that would then export those goods to Lithuania. Very comprehensive kind of sanctions. Now, you'd think, and I personally heard the Lithuanian foreign minister saying as much, actually, Lithuanian exports to China don't amount to very much. Think of Germany, my country, where in 2020 we had 213 billion euros trade exchange. What is Lithuania in comparison? But my point actually is that the European Union is, the Brexiteers may remember that with a grudge, is a single market, and that means it is an integrated market. And that means that companies sourcing from Lithuania or to Lithuania are hit as well, as I just explained. So the European Union, through Lithuania as a whole, is hit. It's a stark warning for other European countries, EU countries, not to follow the Lithuanian example. And for example, the Czech and Slovakian economies are deeply embedded into the German car supply chains. So if they did something like Lithuania, that would hit German car supplies enormously. Now, the European Union in return has threatened to take China to the WTO if those obstacles preventing Lithuanian exports from accessing the Chinese markets are not removed. And also, very recently, Brussels has implemented or initiated, created a so-called anti-coercion instrument with which it wants the European Union to retaliate against economic coercion. So actually, the ground is set for a full-scale controversy between the European Union as a whole and China. And the German Federation of Industry went as far as to speak about a boycott that will impact the EU as a whole. And imports from China, they say, which are needed in German manufacturing facilities in Lithuania, are also affected, as are, as I said, exports from Germany to China. So if China is prepared to decouple economically from politically undesirable partners, in the case of the European Union, that amounts to decoupling from the EU as a whole. And if we talk about the European Union relationship with China, it doesn't help much to look at only Germany or look at only Lithuania or Italy or what. We need to see it as a whole. Now, my second point is maybe a foundational question. Is China's economy, they've been continuing the policy of reform and opening for 40 years now, is it becoming more or less like those of the European Union or other open market economies? And that answer, after those 40 years, couldn't be more important, because mutual trust, as we observe, has eroded dramatically, because the European Union is more and more convinced that it has been taken advantage of through unfair Chinese economic practices. And China, in return, insists that it is, in fact, continuing reforming and just needs more time to do so. And it compares itself, the second largest economy in the world, still compares itself to a developing nation. Now, if China is converging with open market systems, then it would mean that its leaders still see benefit in economic liberalization. And policymakers in Europe, in Brussels, and our countries, and Britain too, and in other open market economies in the United States, obviously, could assume that Xi Jinping will eventually be compelled by his desire for continued growth to make more concessions to international norms, such as reducing industrial subsidies, opening up further to foreign capital, and the like. And if that were the case, our businesses could count on predictability, and they would continue to invest in China with confidence. Now, to answer that, please do remember two terms. One is dual circulation, and the other is common prosperity. The first one was decided on by the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party in 2019. The second was created by Xi Jinping last year. Dual circulation means that China now tries to create two economic circulation systems. One only for the Chinese market, and one connecting China to the rest of the world. And that would help China to isolate itself, immunize itself against detrimental effects from the outside. And that, however, would also mean that foreign companies investing in China would have to become, if they want to do business in China, become part of the solely domestic circulation system. While only what China needs from abroad, or what it sells abroad, will be part of the second circulation system. And if that is implemented, of course, it means that China is becoming less open rather than more open, to return to the question I just said, I just posed. And the second point is common prosperity. Now, that is a term coming from Mao Zedong's days, which doesn't sound, it sounds very harmless to us, but actually it is a very leftist term, which means and signifies the will of the state to interdict, to try to confine the growth of successful companies, mainly, of course, in private ownership in the country, if their owners, shareholders too, make simply too much money, so that some of it needs to be siphoned off and be redistributed among the population at large to help common prosperity of all to grow. So that would mean a leftist turn of the country. And both we need to observe in October of this year, when the Communist Party meets for its party congress, because there will be decisions taken on that. And if China is diverging from open market systems, then that would signal that Beijing believes the country can sustain sufficient growth, even as the government clamps down on its market economy under the motto of common prosperity. And that would mean that policymakers in Europe would be justifying in reassessing the way their countries engage with China and think more strategically about protecting our own supply chains and our own companies, even if those companies haven't yet fully realized the risk. I see I'm coming close to the end of my 10 minutes. I just want to make that one point, that the question of market access has been something that has been discussed ever since China began to open up. And it has always been the Chinese argument, while we're still developing, we cannot fully allow foreign companies to access our market. Now, China in 2001 joined the WTO, and it promised at the time that within 15 years, it would become a full market economy, liberal market economy. It didn't. That's why it is not yet recognized by the WTO as a market economy. But look at what happened in those 20 years since China joined the WTO. Every 7 years, its gross domestic product doubled. Since 2009, the PRC has been the world's export champion. And since 2010 already, that's 11 years, it's the second largest economy. So we all benefit. Companies, Western companies who do good business in China and have grown with China. But what is happening now? You see the collapse of the international financial system in 2008, 2009 led China to believe that countries like Europeans lost their role as a model for China. China would not want to be a workbench anymore for the rest of the world. And it has indeed become a high-tech country with digital corporations, some of which are bigger than those in the United States. But China has not kept its commitments to the WTO. Since 2001, 50 WTO cases against China have been launched. The situation has improved somewhat with regard to pirated products. But we see that after 20 years, the share of, for example, European banks in the Chinese market is 0.2%. And I think in the case of insurances, it is 2% or so. China has set up global champions in wind turbines, in the solar industry, in trains, have been siphoning off Western technology and now selling our trains with a different look in countries like Saudi Arabia or in Africa or elsewhere. So I think companies are loath to minimize their profit-live engagement. That's understandable. They cling to hope. But to me, it seems the time comes where less exposure is the safer bet. And don't forget the figures I mentioned initially. We are the largest trading partner of China. That also means while we export about 200 billion euro to China, we import about 300. That is a considerable deficit and an income plus for China. So one might be tempted to test who is more dependent on whom. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Volker. That's very interesting. Mathieu?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I'm very pleased to be on the same panel with Volker, Stanzel, and Monique in particular, because these are two people from whom I learned quite a lot over this past, should I say, decade. And I'm glad to bring my contribution to this discussion on EU-China relations. And I like the framing you provided in the beginning, which was very IR realist. And I would like to use this as an introduction because, for a long time, you wouldn't have been able to say that Mearsheimer is dominating the thinking in Europe regarding relations with China. Actually, quite the opposite. The socialization school of foreign policy has long been mainstream in Europe and in the United States to some extent, by which I mean that there was the belief that through engaging China, we would produce some sort of a convergence in terms of political systems, but also in terms of economic systems. And that was the assumption on which European foreign policy towards China was built. And it was the case until a turning point was reached, I would say around 2014, 2015, 2016. Those years were really a crucial moment for the development of EU-China relations. Interestingly, a similar turning point took place in the United States, but I tend to believe that even though there are a lot of transatlantic exchanges regarding relations with China, there was an autonomous European assessment on the domestic governance trends, but also the international behavior of China under the leadership of Xi Jinping that took place those years. And it led to the what we call now the the triptych or the trio, which was enshrined into EU foreign policy documents towards China in 2016 and 2019, that basically describe relations with China as relations with a systemic rival, a strategic competitor, but also a cooperation partner in some areas, which was, I think, rightly so, analyzed as the abandonment of some sort of a naivety in European thinking regarding China, that more engagement would lead to more convergence. And that's my first point, basically, that we have given up the illusion of convergence with China. So the relationship between the EU and China is conducted from the EU side from a more realistic perspective. But then let's unpack the three parts of the European, basically, let's call it policy towards China. The cooperation agenda first. To be very frank, there's not much left on the cooperation agenda between the EU and China. Volker mentioned described the economic and trade relations and mentioned the question of dependence and mutual dependence. You, Kamil, in your introduction mentioned the comprehensive agreement on investment, which was signed but not ratified, as a great example of where we are currently. If you ask European diplomats, so what is on your agenda when it comes to cooperation with China? It's not very, concrete. There is this idea that China is unavoidable if you really want to address the climate change crisis. And so, discussion keeps going, and it's important to engage, and it's important to convince, and it's important to convey the same messages again and again in Beijing. If you ask, people who conduct foreign policy towards China, they will tell you that during year 2021, there were some achievements on the diplomatic front. For example, one example that comes up a lot is that China has agreed to cancel Dept through the Paris Club. This may be the most important achievement of European diplomacy towards China in 2021. There was, some achievements on biodiversity last year, but this is a very meager agenda, to be frank. And if you compare that to what was the thinking in Europe about 10 years ago, if you look nowhere else than the EU-China strategic agenda for 2020 and the list of issues on the political and security pillar, what you realize is that the EU has basically given up, a strong push for engaging China on political and security hotspots worldwide. This agenda has almost disappeared from the list of priorities of the European Union towards China. It's been replaced by what I described as an entirely defensive agenda centered on the EU itself, not something that you negotiate bilaterally with China, but building up a toolbox of defensive measures to address asymmetries and unbalances in the relationship. You could list those measures. Each is interesting. Some of them are on the trade and investment front. I'm thinking of the investment screening regulation that was put in place in Europe since October 2020, that is currently in place, and that helps screen incoming foreign direct investment to ensure that no excessive leverage is being actually bought through FDIs, or that no sensitive technologies are being transferred in an intangible way. And even though the mechanism is country agnostic, and even though, in fact, the latest figures show that there are more foreign direct investment being screened from the US and from Switzerland than from China. This is really a mechanism that was built with the political aim of rebalancing the relationship with China. Trade defense instruments is another one that I would mention. But what I think is really important on this is that this toolbox is in the process of being built. New instruments are coming. Volker mentioned the anti-coercion instruments and all the controversies that it is currently creating in the context of Lithuania's-China relations deteriorating sharply. The international procurement instrument is also next on the list. This would give the European Commission a tool to impose some form of reciprocity in the area of public markets. The philosophy of it being that if there is a public market in your country inside the EU and that a tender on an offer comes from a country that does not ensure the same conditions for European companies to access their public markets, then there will be measures to ensure reciprocity, meaning basically conditions being imposed or even companies being excluded from those markets. So there is a very strong emphasis currently at the EU level on building this toolbox of defensive measures. This is dominating the EU-China agenda from a European perspective. Let me end with two points. One on the security agenda in the Indo-Pacific, and I'm throwing the term Indo-Pacific in the discussion because I think it's important as well to approach and understand the trends in EU-China relations. The EU member states, some of them are trying to make a contribution to the security order in East Asia, and this is being framed as an Indo-Pacific strategy with the aim in particular to promote an international maritime order based on the law of the sea. This is being done through diplomatic means. This is also being done through naval deployments through the South China Sea. I think it's an interesting development in EU-China relations because this clearly shows a very strong divergence between Europe and China in the way we perceive security trends in China's periphery. There is a question of positioning Europe in the US-China rivalry, and the security front is one of the key elements of that positioning. I don't think that despite the EU using the language of the Indo-Pacific, that we are seeing the emergence of a very strong transatlantic united front on that issue, actually. And I think that increasingly we see France and Germany in particular using the language of the third way, connecting their Indo-Pacific strategy to the idea that the key problem is not the regional behavior of China, but rather the reemergence of bipolarity in the international system. And so Europe proposes a third way to countries in the region so that they don't have to make a clear choice between the US and China. This is really the language that is increasingly dominating the discussion in Europe. I think it comes from Germany and not really from France, but I observe that France is increasingly, incorporating this language and this perspective in its Indo-Pacific strategy, also in the context of AUKUS. And maybe, a final point for our later discussion on Lithuania and anti-coercion to add to what Volker has already said. I believe that over the past 5 years, the EU member states have really converged on united policy towards China, that there is greater coherence, greater unity. There have been problems with divisions on some specific issues, but this question of anti-corruption in the case of Lithuania is creating an amazing level of division within the European Union. I think it's really a test of EU unity. You hear different analysis, different voices inside the Commission, across member states, inside countries. I think it's very true of Lithuania itself, but also of Germany and France, the ones that I follow the most. And it's really going to be a huge test because this is going to dominate the EU-China agenda in the coming weeks and months. I'll end here and happy to hand over to you.
Thank you. Monique. Make sure to unmute yourself.
Can you see? Yeah?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you for the contributions made by the previous two speakers. My assignment is to focus on the discussion of Europe and the rise of China by focusing on a very interesting area of emerging technologies. Firstly, I'll define what I mean by emerging technologies by giving two specific examples. One is advanced semiconductors, and the second is 5G. And in these both sub-areas, I will then discuss where EU stands. And finally, I'll wrap up the discussion of the rise of China in emerging technologies and the EU-US pushback. And so according to Roundtable and his co-authors, emerging technologies can be defined by 5 features. They include radical novelty, fast growth, coherence, prominent impact, and uncertainty and ambiguity. And there are many interesting examples of emerging technologies in the literature. They include, for example, advanced semiconductors, artificial intelligence, 5G, and quantum computing. Because of time constraint, I would just focus on semiconductors and 5G in the context of discussion of the rise of China and how Europe has responded. So advanced semiconductors are very important building blocks of modern electronic systems today. They are very important in national security terms, not only because they are dual use in nature, but also because of the technological trend of spin on. Namely, nowadays, it is the commercial companies that are leading edge players, really shaped in the direction of the technological evolution in this very important strategic industry. So any aspiring power in the international system today, say in the case of China, that aspires to really maximize growth in its military and economic power, will really be dreaming of building a very strong semiconductor industry at home. And China especially has used a lot of industrial policies in pursuit of semiconductor primacy, even though there are many questions to be asked and discussed as to whether or not these endeavors have been successful. Crucially, in recent years, we have seen that semiconductor has become a very important battlefield for Sino-US rivalry. In particular, since the Trump administration, Washington has endeavored to control access to advanced semiconductor equipment and technologies by Chinese entities. Of course, you can argue that these type of policy measures are designed to really exploit the Chinese reliance on foreign technologies in this very important field. For example, the Department of Commerce has already included over 200 Chinese entities on its entity list. So this list is primarily a blacklist. So it really identifies Chinese entities that the Americans viewed have been engaging in activities against the American national security or foreign policy interests. And in particular, many of the Chinese firms have been on the blacklist, including Huawei, Zhongxin, and SMIC, China's #1 semiconductor manufacturer. Over time, the Americans have actually tightened related screening of the foreign takeovers involving sensitive semiconductors, which are really designed to try to weaken the Chinese efforts of acquiring related semiconductor firms. So in this context, where does Europe stand? My thinking is, in many ways, I think European Union or EU member states or Europe as a whole, if we still include the little United Kingdom as part of that broad Europe definition. In general, I think Europe has been sandwiched between the two powers. The American pressure is actually twofold. The first one is that under the Trump administration, because of the modification of the direct product rule in the American export control regime, that change in rule has actually extended the reach of the American controls to other countries' suppliers, which attempt to sell to Chinese firms. And the European firms are under this type of influence. Secondly, the European Union member states have been under pressure to really introduce very similar regulations that are designed to control the Chinese mergers and acquisitions of sensitive Chinese semiconductor firms in Europe. For example, France introduced a law in 2019 that is designed to enforce a prior authorization system for investment in the semiconductor industry. And this very much has imitated a similar, which was actually set up for the arms industry. However, it is very important to note that the European firms, or in general, private firms elsewhere, have really had their respective interest calculations when it comes to related regulations that are designed to control semiconductor technology flow to China. And SML, which is the Dutch semiconductor equipment firm, is a case in point. And here I want to quote the CEO of the company. During an interview in April last year, he expressed his concerns about all these existing export control regulations, which have been designed to really hinder companies like his from selling to the Chinese market. Quote, if you shut out the Chinese with export control measures, you will force them to strive toward tech sovereignty. In 15 years' time, they will be able to do it all by themselves, and the market will be gone. To be fair, I am skeptical of his assessment as the Chinese potential to catch up in the area of semiconductor equipment in 15 years' time. But this quote does reflect a very typical perspective from the business sector, because private firms are interest maximizers. If we assume they are rational actors, their firms exist in order to sell to any markets in the world, including the Chinese market. What about the case of 5G? And this refers to the 5th generation of mobile technologies. And you have read in the news about this term countless times in recent years. But I think it's very important to explain why 5G matters in security terms in our context of discussion of EU-China relations. So the 5G is expected to increase the speed of data transfer, which is estimated to be 200 times faster than 4G. And it can also improve bandwidth over existing 4G technologies. So in a nutshell, the introduction of 5G can actually enable new military and commercial applications. And before Huawei has been put under a lot of pressure through various containment policies introduced by America and other countries, Huawei was a global leading player in 5G. And today it's a separate story, and we can talk about this later. Crucially, new 5G technology can potentially open national networks up to cyber attacks if suppliers of 5G are not carefully scrutinized. So therefore, 5G networks can actually represent a unique security challenge, particularly because a lot of the functions depend on software, which leaves it quite vulnerable to malicious attacks. So where does Europe stand in the discussion of 5G and the rise of China? In recent years, we have seen that lots of debates have carried out as to whether or not respective national governments would include Huawei, the Chinese firm, as one of the 5G network supplier. It's very interesting to note that previously the UK did include Huawei on its supply list, but UK actually experienced a U-turn in terms of policy. And one can argue that this has been driven by very strong lobbies, which have really highlighted the potential security risks to the British critical national infrastructure, underpinned by the potential of 5G network supplied by Huawei. And I think among the European member states, the various threat perceptions of China still matter, even though Mathieu did mention earlier that there seems to be a convergence of the perception of China in a large part of different issue areas. So finally, to sum up, in recent years, we have seen that China has been viewed as a potential rising power in different areas of emerging technologies, especially 5G and also quantum computing, as well as AI. The Chinese have endeavored to introduce various policies in order to become a global leader as well as standard setter for the next generation industries. Of course, some of these measures can become extremely controversial, and they include aggressive foreign investment measures, acquisitions, and regulations favoring domestic firms. Crucially, a major development in terms of the transatlantic cooperation in the wake of China's rise in emerging technology arena was the decision made last year to set up a new institution, namely EU-US Trade and Technology Council. So this council has already endeavored to set up 10 working groups to look into different issue areas where transnational cooperation can become possible. And this can include, for example, the promotion of joint standards around emerging technologies, the cooperation between EU and the US in order to deal with the challenges from issues of global supply chain disruptions, or the potential to really increase financial incentives to companies in Europe and US in order to bring semiconductor manufacturing home. Because for a prolonged period of time, semiconductor manufacturing has concentrated in the Pacific region, especially Taiwan, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, and China. However, the question is, to what extent will the EU and US forge a very effective technological cooperation in order to deal with China's rise in various areas of emerging technologies? And I would leave that question open, and perhaps we can discuss this further during the Q&A. And finally, I just want to mention a few words about my own policy recommendations, which I raised during the RUSI event in spring last year. And Mathieu also took part in that debate, in that roundtable. In that particular roundtable, the theme was about potential transatlantic cooperation in the area of semiconductors. And I believe that if the Europeans does take the issue of microelectronic supply very seriously, then perhaps the European Commission should work with the European Defense Agency and Space Agency to look into the possibility of set up a trusted foundry project following the American model. And finally, in terms of potential cybersecurity threats in the area of semiconductors, but because of the deepening globalization of semiconductor production, I propose that perhaps NATO can actually work with DARPA to look into various areas of chipping detection and also prevention. I'll stop it here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Monique. That's really interesting. And thank you, everyone, for those contributions. We still have about 30 minutes for the discussion. If there are any questions, I invite everyone to write the questions in the chat. That's proven the most effective and quickest way to ask questions. And there was already a number of questions as we were starting our discussion. So one is from Benjamin. China is taking over the world through debt trap diplomacy and aggressive strategy over Hong Kong and Taiwan. Authoritarianism is rising and the USA and UK are weak in their response. I volunteered in Burma before coming to Southampton for 16 months, and seeing how China pillages the country of its wealth was eye-opening. So the question here is, why doesn't the West do more? I'm guessing do more to contain China, to protect countries around China. So is there something the United States or Europe that they can do more in response to the Chinese threat, especially in the region, South China Sea, etc.? Is there anyone who would like to answer that?
Yeah, I can say a few words, but I believe Mathieu's, it's really Mathieu's topic, and he'll have something to say as well. China takes over the world. That's really great, great title for a book or an op-ed piece, but the reality is a bit more difficult. The motivation for China's external policy is extremely difficult to fathom. We see the result that, as you has observed, countries become increasingly dependent on China. Does China want that? Was that the objective? Or was it rather a defensive measure to make the power of the CCP ever safer? This is something that is very difficult to find out. But it should give us pause in judging what China actually is up to. That doesn't mean that we don't need to deal with it. You heard my own proposal, which will hurt companies if implemented enormously, and there is no way around it. But we should not just see the world in lose-lose, win-win terms, and China's winning the war, which war, and the West is losing it. That is much too simple. What is the West's response? No, we are not authoritarian countries. And we're not just one country where there's one supreme leader who can, a chairman who can define what needs to be done and makes mistakes or doesn't make mistakes. No, in democracies, you have a process of gradual opinion building and arrival at decisions, which then again have to be coordinated multilaterally. It's nice to have the policeman USA around if you're satisfied with everything he does, but many countries have not been that happy with it. So the situation that we have now, we have a group of, well, the Americans counted 100 democracies who share an interest in countering the aggressive policy emanating from Beijing. What they can do is what is presently being discussed. And our discussion here is a case in point. What I think what we need is a little bit more confidence, a little bit more trust in the workability of our democracies and our ability to defend ourselves.
Thank you, Volker. Anyone else wanted to contribute here? Yeah, Mathieu.
Yes, I can add a few things. And I will rephrase slightly the question to be able to answer in a way that suits me slightly better. So I would rephrase it as, why doesn't Europe embrace a containment strategy towards China, which is objectively the case? And I think that there are three main reasons for that. Ideas, the balance of power, and the balance of interest. So ideas first, I think I mentioned it in my introduction. There's a lot of people in decision-making circles who think that the problem is less the rise of China than the rise of US-China bipolarity that reduces, in fact, the options for European countries because it creates binary choices on everything. I don't think that there is a widespread consensus across Europe that we should define European foreign policy towards China and towards the United States using those terms. But I think that this vision of the international system is very influential. And of course, it leads to foreign policy decisions that are meant to mitigate the US-China rivalry, to find, in fact, specific space for Europe and opportunities for Europe, taking advantage, in reality, of that re-emerging bipolar system. That's one constraining factor. The second constraining factor, the balance of power, is that even when, and there are many cases, even when European countries and the EU oppose China on one or another issue, there is always the question of how do you, in fact, act on your ideas. And I think that's the reason why you can observe the construction of a defensive toolbox at the EU level, but also a very inward-looking approach on relations with China. Our action is very much focused on Europe. When it comes to competition in third countries, which would be a proper containment strategy, there are some actions being taken. Deployment of naval forces in the South China Sea is one example. Putting together a kind of alternative offer to the Belt and Road Initiative with global gateways to come up with packages of infrastructure and development aid in third countries is a way to compete with China in third countries in the Indo-Pacific space. But really, the focus of Europe's action currently is inward looking. And I should add to that the fact that China has been able to turn the tables on Europe on the issue of authoritarian influence versus promotion of democracy. If you compare the situation currently to the situation, let's say 10 years ago, I think Xi Jinping has been extremely successful with his set of national security legislation to completely control the activities of foreign NGOs in China. I think that the Great Firewall works well, even though there are VPNs in China, but this really controls the spread of ideas and democratic influence and liberal influence inside China. And on the other side, the issue now is more the rise of Chinese authoritarian influence across Europe on media freedom, on academic freedom. There is the question of limiting democratic choices that arises from time to time. There is a very, very recent interesting example in Canada. There are also examples in Australia. Not really yet anything substantial in Europe, but there has been a turn in this question of who influences whom and against whom do we build our defenses. And then finally, there is the balance of interests, and that can be summed up quite quickly. In fact, there are many vested interests in a substantial trade and investment relationship with China in the European corporate world. For many companies, this represents a huge growing market still. And we do talk a lot about the German automotive industry and its influence over European foreign policy towards China. I think there is also the influence of the French luxury industry, which perhaps is not as strong, but should not be completely underestimated. There are many interests in, a healthy trade and investment relationship with China. And it's also the case of the United States, and it's a constraining factor to the US policy of competing with China.
Thank you, Mathieu. Did you want to add something, Monique, or not this time?
No, I'll skip this.
That's okay. So the next question we have from Hannah, and it's about the EU, China, and the Balkan countries. Do you think some of the Balkan states that are not members of the EU, Serbia, North Macedonia, Albania, Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo, for example, are becoming strategic hubs for Chinese interests in Europe due to the neglect by the EU? And if that's the case, is there something that the EU can do about it? Anyone has any views about the Balkan countries?
Can you explain that thing about the neglect?
Well, I think what is meant is that those countries or some of those countries are in the process of negotiating the membership, but the EU has been arguably dragging its feet, and countries like France are less than enthusiastic about EU expansion, and yeah, that may be seen as kind of neglect in this region.
I think that needs to be discussed, but this is not the place for it.
Yeah. So is the Balkan region a kind of growing hub for China's
I can comment on
interest?
it in the spirit of not accepting the term neglect.
Yeah.
It's very much a case in point of the whole dispute between some Balkan countries, not all, and Brussels, that those some Balkan countries think they're in a position to sort of blackmail the European Union. If you don't give us what we need, then we will get it from somewhere else, and we may kiss the flag of China, if only to show Brussels we don't need them, or we go into debt like Montenegro to buy an unusable bit of car highway that nobody can use, but which means the country is indebted to China for I don't know how many years or decades. So if that is the game, if you don't give me what I want, then I turn to someone else. Then this is the best ideal breeding ground for controversies between, on the one hand, Brussels and the capitals of these Balkan countries, and of course also between Brussels and Beijing.
Well, one thing I will kind of mention as the new European Commission, as Ursula von der Leyen was preparing to take over the presidency of the European Commission, I do remember her and the new commissioners kind of mentioning the Balkans, the Western Balkan region, also in the context of the growing China's influence. And this is, I think, or it has been an argument of the European Commission executive, this kind of nudging the member states that, yeah, they should probably rethink the way they think about the enlargement of the EU. It's not just about doing favors to less developed countries and admitting them to the European Union, but also paying attention who else is interested in influencing those countries and recognizing that. So I think there is a degree of kind of geopoliticization of the region that perhaps was not there 15 or 20 years ago to that extent. Would you agree? Either of you.
Next question.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. Yeah. John Glenn, to what degree do the individual trade and investment patterns of the individual European Union members give rise to tensions in foreign policy. For example, compared to France, Germany has had more positive trade balance with China.
Well, that's something I tried to lay out at the beginning. It is often made mistake to see isolated European countries and their relationship with China. Obviously, Germany has the largest trade exchange with China, but how much of those 200 billion euros is money that in the end ends up in coffers of companies in France or Lithuania or Slovakia or where? We have an integrated market, and we would be much wiser if we regarded the situation, the relationship between the EU and China as a whole, up into the minutest details. Where do we actually produce in countries outside of Europe, outside of the European Union, things that are being sold in China or things that are being produced by European and Chinese companies together and being sold in Europe later on. Our Mathieu and my good friend François Godemont has used the term of piggybacking, sitting on the back of other companies that help companies that are too small to do business with China on their own, help get into the China business. That is what this integrated market is about.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else want to contribute to that question? Okay, so the next one is from Lacey. China appears to be expanding its Belt and Road initiatives into Eastern Europe, including Hungary, or most notably Hungary. What effect do you think this has on the EU's negotiating power on economic and political / human rights issues? So the expansion of the Belt and Road initiatives, it's not just Hungary, of course, those kind of trade economic investment projects are all over Eurasia. So what's the effect on the EU's negotiating power on issues like human rights, the issues that are very dear to the European integration project? Any views on that?
I can give it a try first, and it's true that Hungary broke ranks with the EU on several occasions on China matters. Is it the effect of the depths of trade and investment relations between Hungary and China? I don't think it's only a question of Chinese economic statecraft. There's also Hungary's positioning within the EU, the question of liberal versus illiberal values, and the game that the Orban government has been playing inside the European Union. And I would tend to not fully agree with the framing of the question as China expanding its Belt and Road initiatives into Eastern Europe currently. I don't think that, currently being 2021, the post-COVID context, and to me, I see China facing new setbacks in Eastern Europe, actually. I think Lithuania is a very important case that has, that reverberates beyond the Baltic region towards the whole EU. But there's also the very interesting dynamics at play in the Czech Republic. And again, this involves Taiwan. There are also, I would argue, questions regarding the current state of China-Poland relations, even though, the issue is complicated by the state of US-Poland relations, but it's very, interesting to observe what has been the Polish reaction to the post-signature phase of the comprehensive agreement on investment, in fact, even though Poland signed it, but the Polish government was one of the governments that was the less prone to support ratification at the time. I mean, there has been an evolution of that position during the course of 2021, but I think that the Polish government is also looking at Taiwan in ways that was not the case before. And so, all added together, and with the demise of the 17+1 framework, with Lithuania breaking ranks, one thing that we have not yet mentioned in this discussion, it's very important to note that the overall dynamic of the 16+1 framework created by China to basically divide and go around the resistances it faces in the EU, the dynamic is quite negative from a Chinese perspective, with Lithuania breaking ranks and maybe further questions regarding other countries, thinking of Estonia. So, a massive Chinese Belt and Road Initiative expanding footprint in Eastern Europe is not really something that I see currently.
Thank you. Volker?
Let me add a word. BRI in Eastern Europe, that's one thing, and Mathieu has described it, I think, very aptly. But if you want to look where BRI is really successful, then you need to go to Western Europe. The city of Duisburg in the west of Germany prides itself of being the last terminal of the BRI railroad. Now, we know that there are similar cities in Portugal, or there's London, or there's a northern German city or Polish city that also regards itself as the last terminal of the BRI railroad. But they all show that if China tries not to be attractive in countries that are interested in BRI because they lack the funds for implementing their ambitious projects like Montenegro, if they go to countries that have more funds for infrastructure available, there's much more ground for fertile cooperation. And to go to the background of the backdrop of the question that your student posed, yes, indeed, that has a political impact. If you talk to people responsible in the city of Duisburg, in the whole region around it, how they regard BRI, they're all enthusiastic. And they cannot understand at all why there should be any doubts anywhere in the world about how beneficial that is. That is cooperation, fertile to both parties. But the two parties have different objectives in mind, of course.
Thank you. Monique?
Can I just add one point, not in relation to BRI, but in relation to what Mathieu alluded to earlier regarding the Czech Republic case, in particular in the area of technology. So recently I was involved in a closed-door roundtable about ways in which the Czech Republic and Taiwan, through the organization of two separate think tanks, to cooperate in order to curb potential cybersecurity threats from China, and also in order to introduce measures to try to stop the illicit transfers of technologies. So this, to me, is something that is quite new. And I think it is really developing quite rapidly. And again, I think this goes back to my earlier assignment by focusing on the areas of technologies. And perhaps Mathieu can also add a thing or two regarding this, if there's time left. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. So then we have a question from Libertas. It is a very interesting aspect which Mr. Duchâtel touched about Lithuania's situation testing the EU unity. With EU lacking a strong common foreign policy, would it be more efficient for the Union to follow France's lead and create a more independent foreign policy stance, security system in Europe, or sticking with American viewpoint instead would be a better path to avoid these kind of situations in the future EU-China relations?
What about Germany? Where does Germany stand? Sorry.
Germany will pay for it.
Maybe we can all try to do justice to this excellent question, but a very tricky one. What is missing to give you a good answer is a good understanding of the domestic situation in Lithuania and who's pushing for whom. But I will assume in my answer that Lithuania will stick to the line of having a representative office from Taiwan named Taiwanese Representative Office, and that Lithuania will stick to the line of developing trade and technology relations with Taiwan, including with support from Taiwanese credit lines and all the things that have been announced in the past week. If Lithuania sticks to that line, my assumption is that for Lithuania to get strong support from the European Commission, all EU member states, it will take time and it will be difficult. I mentioned division across Europe on this. I'm personally a little bit concerned that there will be a rising force politically within Europe that will tell Lithuania to basically, shift position on this. The anti-coercion discussion is very, very interesting. When it started, we were considering two different sorts of response. One would be countermeasures. So if a state is coerced, there are countermeasures against the state that has coerced the EU member states. But another aspect was compensation. So, if you're being coerced, you get compensation from the EU or other member states. There is a solidarity. In the current version of the Commission, compensation has disappeared. There's only countermeasures. And I think that the Lithuanian case is, not to blame, but is one of the reasons why the discussion regarding the tools evolved in the direction of giving up compensation, because there are a lot of people within the Commission who think that this is incitement for risk-taking behavior, and that Lithuania is the great example of a country that gambles on a European position and jeopardizes the interest of the whole Union. I'm painting a very dark picture, I know, but I think the picture is not fully dark. I think we are divided, and I described the view of the people who think Lithuania should be held responsible for its choices, and but there's also, of course, the other side who thinks that this is a question of the EU market, the unity of the EU single market. This is a question of sovereign foreign policy choices, and this is a question also of values, in fact, democratic values versus authoritarian values, and there should not even be, any time spent on questioning why Lithuania has taken that decision. So to answer your question, I don't think that following the French championing the notion of strategic autonomy would basically save Lithuania from everything I have described. I think that the US has to be in the picture. I do not think that the notions of European sovereignty or the notion of strategic autonomy are a guarantee that that kind of issue will not happen again in the future in EU-China relations.
I fully agree with what Mathieu has said. And I'd just like to add, as a way of illustrating the severity of the problem, first, a remark from a foreign ministry official from a neighboring country of Lithuania, and it's not Russia, who said, Lithuanian behavior was reckless. Now, how come that a neighboring country regards Lithuanian behavior as reckless, even though these countries usually cooperate quite closely with each other? How come that Lithuania decides on taking such a measure quite unilaterally, without consulting in Brussels or without telephoning around among their friends? And there is a rumor going around in Brussels that actually it was the United States that instigated Lithuania to act in that way and to compensate in whichever way for damage incurred. And of course, there is a certain logic to that kind of thinking. It shows, again, what Mathieu has emphasized so strongly, how divided we are in a situation like that, that takes us completely by surprise. But the first thing we really need to tell the Lithuanians, while I'm fully convinced we need solidarity, while we show solidarity at the same time, it must be understood that measures of that kind that may have enormous repercussions for all of us need to be consulted beforehand, either officially in the institutions in Brussels, or at least unofficially by phoning a few friends around Europe. So these kind of measures have to be calibrated carefully in the future. And even if we have strategic sovereignty, strategic autonomy, strategic resilience, whatever you want to call it, we all want it, but even if we have it, it does not mean that we can be careless.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question, and it is about the Arctic. Does anyone have a views about the China's polar Silk Road involving Greenland, and how that may impact EU-China relations? No. Yeah, I thought this was kind of a long shot. Well, we are perfectly on time. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, everyone. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you to the participants and those who asked questions. I did enjoy this discussion thoroughly. If you are on campus or around campus, I invite you to the reception in half an hour in building 5013, sorry, in room 5013 in building 100. Yes, I know not everyone is on or around campus. It would be great to have you all there, but we'll still have some food and drinks there, so I invite you to come. Well, thank you very much again for joining us. Thanks a lot. It's really
Thank
good.
You.
Thank you.
Great day.
Bye-bye. Bon appétit.
Thank you.
Au revoir.